Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Q&A about business, innovation, and managing life. And looks like we have a whole bunch of questions here. I hope I'll have a chance to get to a decent number today. So I had a question from Erin about how do you prepare for your keynote talks about new technologies and Wolfram Language features? Well, the first thing is that I don't start preparing them until as soon beforehand as possible, because I found that there's a tremendous tendency for things that have been being developed, there's a year-long development process and everybody knows that it's supposed to be presented on a particular day. It has a tremendous habit, 3 days out, it's not really quite ready. You might as well wait until you're like 1.5 days out to actually do the preparation, because you just don't know if it's going to be ready or not. You don't know if some new build of some new version is going to be ready or whatever else. So I tend to leave it until sort of the last minute. Now, I've usually had some people helping me collecting material, and they've probably been working for several weeks, a month, more than that, collecting material. And then in the end, it's a question of what goes into the demo and what doesn't. I have to say, I would feel worse about the kind of last minute sort of way of doing this, except that I know, for example, Steve Jobs used to do exactly the same thing. And we were involved in a few of his demos, and it was like, there's just a big row of possible things that might go into the demo. And it's like, okay, this one works well enough, let's do it. This one doesn't work well enough, we're punting, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of the only way that I know to do it. Now, there's often a lot of complexity in doing so. So in terms of giving demos, I've done live coding demos for, oh gosh, I think the first one I did was in 1980, perhaps 81, no, 1980, I think, was my first live coding demo. And it was obviously at the time, it used this strange thing called the light valve projector, which was a very early LCD projector. I was just using, I think, a terminal to do, a character-based terminal. But so I've been doing live demos for a long time, and I could tell you all kinds of funky stories about things that have happened. Like I remember, well, there was an important moment, which was when I could bring my own computer to do the demo. It was the case by the time we were back, let's see, I did a big world sort of tour in 1991. And on that tour, I couldn't bring my own computer. It was still too big, too clunky to bring my own computer. And so we had to get computers set up at each location. I remember the computer that I had, I think it was in Munich in Germany. I pressed the go button to switch it on, and literally the computer exploded. Not very violently, but it was, smoke came out and so on. And that was a big drama to get another computer. You had the audience, but you didn't have a computer. And that was big sort of drama to get that to work. The thing that has been a notable thing to me in giving live demos is, the places where you think, oh, it's going to be really challenging to get the projector working and all this kind of thing, those are the easy ones. The places where you're like, oh, this is going to be totally trivial. This is, a very high-end place. They've got all the equipment. Those are the ones where some crazy thing trips you up. So it's kind of almost a level playing field in terms of what's involved. But in terms of actually giving a live demo, there's a certain, I often give demos that I've never given before, not for things like keynote presentations for new product type things, but in terms of just everyday talks that I give, I'm constantly doing live demos I've never done before. In fact, just recently I was starting to collect some of the demos that I've done, because often in front of live audiences, I've done what turned out to be fairly interesting demos. And it's like, these are good little snippets of demonstration of Wolfram Language. Let's just use them. And so we're going to be collecting some of those. But I think the important thing about live demos is to believe that you can do it. That's the first step. And to not be like, oh my gosh, I couldn't write this code in real time. Well, if you're experienced enough, you probably can in Wolfram Language. I mean, I think it'd be absolutely hopeless in a standard programming language, it's just like that's not a realistic thing to do because not enough happens per sort of character typed. Now, in terms of the keynote type things I've done, we have technology now, I'm pretty sure it's available in the function repository, that lets you create a palette that is essentially an auto-typing palette. Usually we just use it in the mode where it's just pasting things in. So typically I will have created a notebook which has a bunch of inputs I want to use. And then I say, make a palette out of that. Not only is it inputs, it's also URLs and things like this. That creates a palette. I put that on a secondary screen. I use that. I click buttons on that palette to auto paste things into the actual active notebook that I'm using. That saves kind of the typing time. We actually also have technology to auto type it. That's actually very relevant if you're, for example, giving a sort of a taped course or something like that, where you don't want to have to think about what you're typing at the time when you're talking about it. But this is a way so you can auto type, and it kind of looks a little bit easier to understand what's going on when it's being auto typed character by character with little character delays and random distribution of character delays and so on, rather than just boom, here's the answer. Typically, when you start off doing a class or something and you're doing it by very sort of crisp production values recording, you'll want to do some auto typing like that to begin with to get people the idea of what's roughly going on. And then when you have larger inputs or people have gotten used to that, then you can just do a boom, you just paste in the results. Now, the other issue in giving kind of keynote talks about functionality is kind of threading together all the different things one has to talk about. And in the past, I used to really try and make heavily thematic kinds of arcs of that story. I kind of gave up because we have so much to talk about, and there's so many different things that are of interest to so many different kinds of people that I pretty much just decided there's going to be little modules about this, modules about that. And sometimes I even think of mixing it up a bit because I want it to be the case that people who are interested in sort of very mathy content, there's a thing for them, and people who are much more interested in kind of software engineering type things or machine learning, there's a thing for them that comes fairly soon thereafter. So people aren't just like, oh my gosh, when's he going to finish talking about the math stuff? So that's that kind of thing. Now, sometimes there are pieces of demos. People will provide kind of demo material, and it'll be very elaborate. And it's like, if I can't understand the demo, I'm not going to show the demo because I won't be able to communicate it effectively in a short enough time. It's got to be something that's very, cut and dried, straightforward thing. And that applies. Sometimes there are demos that involve additional machines, hardware, showing operations that happen on other kinds of, deploying something to a this, that, or the other thing. And sometimes it's a little bit weird because it's like, well, conceptually, this is very impressive, but there's nothing to show here. It's like bits are going down a wire and nobody can see the bits going down the wire. And to kind of have telemetry from what's happening will sort of be, that will be the whole demo. So it doesn't end up being a thing that's worth demoing. A few points on that. Well, let's see. From Chak here. What barriers currently still exist that keep AR and VR from being widely useful in the workplace? Well, I think the real challenge is, what are you going to do with them? I mean, people have said I remember using a VR system back in 1990, perhaps, and people said it's going to be the future. It's going to be the future for architectural design, for like drug design and molecular visualization. It's going to be the future for gaming, etc. Well, I mean, it's had some success in gaming and virtual worlds kinds of things. I think kind of architectural design, gosh, I mean, first thing there is the difficulty of making real 3D imagery rather than just plan and elevation. That, I think that was, well, 20 years ago, I remember that being involved in a big architectural design project and getting the 3D, even though you had in AutoCAD or something, really good plan elevation type stuff, getting the full 3D geometry was very non-trivial at that time. It may have gotten easier, but that's the first thing. There's not much that you can do that is very interesting in architectural design, let's say, with VR without having actual 3D imagery. I think my impression is maybe that's gotten a little easier. And I don't know whether the whole kind of image generation, machine learning image generation, which kind of helps you fill in details of images and things, maybe that might be more quite transformative for this 3D-ification of things. I don't know. I haven't really looked at that. Because that's sort of the challenge is how do you really get the geometry? And it's just a huge amount of work to get that geometry. Once you have the geometry, then you can kind of go to town on sort of seeing these different views. Now, I don't know how useful that is. I have to say, whenever I've had a VR systems for, oh gosh, I don't know, 20 years, maybe, something like that. And I use them so rarely, it's really just embarrassing. And occasionally, like with our physics project, where we're visualizing hypergraphs. Oh, I should say something here. Back in 1992, I was starting to think about our physics project, and I was starting to think about this kind of network model of space-time and so on. I was starting to think about these networks updating and so on. I had this kind of vision of, oh, it's like a giant spider web, and it's all updating. It's very hard to understand what's going on in it. And we can kind of see these areas that are, bright orange or something where it's updating and so on. And I had this vision of, I want to be in a VR system, and I want to be able to kind of pick my way through the spider web, pulling on pieces of it and kind of getting a sense of what's happening in this kind of evolving network universe and so on. Okay, so that was sort of the vision, and I'd seen early VR systems back in 1991. And well, we're still not at that vision today. And we've tried a variety of times. We've built things that are related to this. It's both a lot of work to build something like this, to build a sort of interactive, you're inside the graph, pick up pieces of it and so on. And it's also a thing where, for me, sort of, well, you go into the VR world and it's like, you know what? Well, let me say something else, which is, in studying, kind of doing computer experiments, things like this, people will often say, oh, why don't you make more movies? And, people say, look at this cool movie. It's got all these things moving around and flying around and shooting things off and so on and so on and so on. And then I say, I don't really understand what's going on in this movie. Let me make a picture that is just like one slice in space through time. Then I've got a picture, and I can really just examine that picture and kind of think about that picture. And I can be thinking as I look at the picture, and I can be looking at different pieces of it and so on. Whereas if I'm watching a movie, it's like I have to be thinking in real time about what's going on in this movie. Sometimes you get an indication from that, but it is not, for me, a very good form of visualization for something you're really going to think about. Something that's kind of a cool demo, great, but something you're really going to think about, hard to do. And I think with VR, it's even worse. That, like, let's say I'm inside the VR spiderweb and I'm pulling on pieces of it. Like, I have no idea what I did. And, we did some experiments, what was it, 2.5 years ago now, for the physics project of VR visualization of our hypergraphs and so on. It just wasn't very useful. I couldn't really tell anything from it. It's a little bit more useful. I have some 3D printouts of these things. That's a little bit more useful. You can pick it up and turn it around. I think that being able to just have it on the screen and move it with a mouse is fine for the 3D thing. But this idea of the singing, dancing, moving thing, I found that very hard to cognitively kind of get much out of it. Now, in terms of other sort of uses of VR and so on, another one that people have often talked about is kind of the VR programming, VR trading, these kinds of things where people sometimes have lots of screens. It's funny because I have a total of, I have 4 screens right now on my primary sort of workspace computer, but 2 primary ones and other ones for special purposes like doing Zoom and things like this, where it's aligned so that I'm kind of looking at a screen that is aligned with the camera and things like that. But I have to say, I have been feeling recently that some of the things I've been doing are just like, they are so multi-windowed that I kind of almost feel like, oh, I should add a few more screens here to be able to do things. And I suppose I can imagine a time when you're kind of like in VR and it's like you've got your sort of virtualized desktop and it's, placed in different places in VR. I don't know that really makes sense. I have to say, even the feature that exists on certainly Mac OS, where you can kind of like zoom in and see all your different windows all aligned as thumbnails, I don't use that very often unless I'm really lost. And the other thing of, oh, let's make the screen look like your desktop. I mean, this kind of model of how to organize things that is sort of like piles on your desktop. I'm not, that's what we all do. It's not my favorite thing, really. And sort of I'd like to have a better way to organize that. I remember back in probably 1979, visiting Xerox PARC, where a bunch of modern user interface technology was invented, and seeing for the first time a window operating system. And people were showing me, oh, you copy, you paste, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, you can't be serious that your ability to copy paste something depends on whether the window is on top of another window. That is just a crazy thing. That couldn't possibly work. That would just be super annoying. And I always remember that every time I'm in a situation where I'm trying to drag a file from one, file browser window to another, and one of the windows is obscured or some other application gets focus and things. I kind of remember that very early demo of this couldn't possibly work. The interesting thing, and it's sort of an interesting thing in terms of assessing computer systems, is it did more or less work. Most of the time it kind of does what you want. There are corner cases that are completely horrifying and which bite you from time to time, but mostly it just works. So it's hard for me to know when we talk about sort of a VR programming environment and, windows all around you and windows on the ceiling and windows on wherever else, whether that's something where, or even things where you can reach out and place kind of virtual monitors and things, whether that is something that is going to be useful or whether it's just going to be a gimmick and a waste of time. I mean, the very fact that the mouse, which is kind of your kind of direct manipulation type thing of moving things around on the screen, that turns out to be really useful. One could imagine a 3D version of that that's implementable in VR that's similarly useful, or it could just be a total mess. I don't know. And I think, there are things that we can readily do. We can place papers on a desk, and that's kind of our model for the Windows system. Because we don't live in the, on the ISS or something, we can't just place things in space and have them stay there. So we haven't really had the sort of human experience of being able to have a 3D desktop. I wonder, actually, I'm kind of almost wondering to ask astronauts whether they've done that, whether they maybe in modern times they're just screens and there isn't a lot of paper, but in older times, did people routinely like put their I suspect not, put their kind of the instructions up here and another one here, another one here, kind of laying them out in 3D space. I suspect not, because I suspect that just the slightest air current and you've kind of, your 3D desktop has been blown up, so to speak, or blown off course. Obviously that wouldn't happen in VR unless you programmed it to happen. And so that sort of remains unclear to me whether the 3D desktop makes sense. And obviously to determine that, one has to await sort of high enough resolution displays, etc. For me personally, I'm still having trouble with VR headsets. I haven't tried the very latest, probably, have I? Maybe I have. But I'm still getting motion sick from the lag associated with the, what my ears record versus what my eyes see in terms of the motion of VR headsets and so on. On the subject of AR, it's a slightly different thing, because in AR, the big thing there, I think, is just going to be, when is it routine to have kind of an AR thing? It's just like, when is it routine to have a smartwatch? When is it routine to have your phone with its camera? It becomes routine at some point. People were not walking around with cameras. I've been trying to find something really obvious that should have been photographed in 1973, but I've asked all these different people who were involved, and nobody seems to have taken a photograph. And some people, the British people mostly, so they tend to have, funny sort of wag things to say in their emails, but it's like everybody wasn't walking around with cameras back in those days, type thing. That became a thing that is now routine, that everybody sort of has a camera in their pocket. And the question will be, when there's a good AR glasses type solution, and sort of one just routinely has AR on one's face, then there are probably uses for AR that are going to be helpful. I mean, it is the case that because you happen to have a camera in your pocket, there are all kinds of things which you now use a camera for that you would never have used a camera for before, because in the past, you're carrying around some big thing and whatever. You won't use a camera for that. You won't use a camera to record, where did you park your car somewhere? No way you're going to use a camera for that when the camera is a great big 35mm thing, and you've got to develop the film or whatever else. Right? But as soon as it becomes something you routinely have, there start to be uses that make sense, even when they're just once every month type uses. And I think the same thing will happen with AR, that when people routinely have sort of the AR, for example, for me, I wear glasses. I don't actually need them very much, but I do wear glasses. My eyesight isn't too bad. My children make fun of me because I've very optimized my glasses so that I really can see well and see very detailed things on a screen or at a distance and so on, better than sort of your average, satisfactory vision type thing, because one can do that. And I've done that just because, whatever, it's convenient. It allows me, for example, on my computer screen to get sort of a higher density of information because I can use smaller fonts and things like this and still be able to see them. But in any case, be that as it may, given that I'm wearing glasses anyway, but once there is sort of an AR solution that sort of just plugs into glasses, then for me, it will be sort of zero cost to be having, AR everywhere. And once I have AR everywhere, I'm sure there will be a bunch of uses for it. I mean, one thing is from the most obvious kind of, you're walking along, give me the sort of the GPS, where do I walk, to the kind of you're talking to somebody and it can remind you who is this person, from your personal database of faces or whatever it is. And here's the information from your search system about when you last interacted with this person, what you might talk to this person about, and so on. All of these kind of advising you about what to do. Some things all of the, let me see my text messages, they're fine. That might be useful, might not be. The teleprompter type stuff. And then things like visual diffs. You walk into a room and it kind of immediately indicates to you, how has this room changed since you were last here? Those types of things. And saves the embarrassment of saying to somebody, don't you look different? And it can say, yes, this person colored their hair a totally different color, or whatever it is. They're trying their purple phase or whatever they might be doing. So in any case, a few thoughts, but I think probably the transformative thing for AR will be when we routinely have AR capability, sort of that we just carry along with us. And then even the small slice of time use cases will be worth doing. So a few thoughts there. Oh my, there's so many questions here, and I feel bad because I'm spending so much time answering each one, but anyway. Brandon is saying, I like the fact that I seem to have fun explaining concepts, particularly related to science. Do I ever have to force that? No, not really. I mean, if I sound enthusiastic, it's because I am enthusiastic. I would say that the one thing I've learned about that kind of thing is, I do meetings, I live stream some of them sort of all day long. And one of the things I kind of learned at some point is you can come in like an Eeyore to a meeting, and it's just like, why are you doing this? I mean, it's worth just having that dash of enthusiasm right when you start. It's like, okay, let's get started, let's see the agenda type thing. And there's a certain kind of initial energy that I wouldn't say it's forced, but it's something where, I could imagine myself saying, oh, I just woke up, oh, what's going on? And it's worth just having that little push to, okay, we're here, boom, let's get started, some energy into that. Once that's happened, you're kind of off and running. I will say a thing about sort of initial energy. When I give talks, particularly in sort of settings with actual physical settings with people there, there's this question about how does it start? It's an interesting thing now that I think about it. As I've been doing these live streams, I'm just sitting here looking at a camera and talking to you all. I kind of gotten used to that. And so for me, there's nothing kind of, whatever my emotional state is when I start, it's whatever my emotional state usually is when I start, which turns out to be just fine. But when I give a talk in a physical location, there are things about that physical location that can either add energy or drain energy from me. And, there are situations where you'll be giving a talk, and one thing that got me years ago, not so much recently, is you're giving a talk to a very big audience, 1,000 people, more than that, whatever it is. And it's a big fancy setup, and you're on a stage, and there are lights, and the audience is completely black. And, the first few times that happened to me, it was quite disorienting, because you're talking to complete blackness. I mean, when I'm talking to a camera, I'm like, I kind of imagine it like I'm talking to some, kind of one-eyed animal type thing, where it's kind of like, I can have a conversation with it. But the pure blackness really got to me the first few times. And similarly, in sort of audience settings, there are like rooms where it's a big cavernous room, and there's people there, but they're very distant, and they look kind of bored, and you can't really tell what's going on. And then there are things where there's sort of been a trend, I would say, at some universities, I think it started in business schools, where you have this kind of little tiny amphitheater type seating where sort of there's stacked up rows, and it's kind of a very, somehow it ends up, I find, those tend to be very engaged. They feel very engaged. It feels like the audience is really, paying attention. You're really having a conversation. It's not like I'm going yak, 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 and everybody else is asleep. I have to say, when I give physical talks, one of the things that can happen is if I can tell the audience is kind of losing me, it's really it just sucks energy out of the whole situation. And I know I do worse in those situations. And, I remember one thing I did quite recently, actually, where the audience was, it just made perfect sense. They would be very engaged. And I hadn't really realized that for various reasons, they'd heard a bunch of the things I was saying before, so they weren't as interested. And as soon as I could sort of sense they weren't as interested, I would say the quality of my talk went way down. I've also found that, and this is true for giving talks and for writing things, that kind of once that initial start of how am I roughly, what is the sort of, what is my approach to this audience? That's a very important thing to define. And sometimes I have if I can just get the first couple of sentences, the first couple of thoughts that I'm going to present for this audience, then I'm off and running. And if I can't get that, and it's just like, well, I'm here and hello, we're starting now, and I don't know where I'm starting, that's a bad thing. Once I'm, at the beginning with energy, so to speak, things tend to continue from there. A few thoughts on that. The question from Mikhail, do I take part in clinical trials? Well, thankfully, touch wood, I have not had things wrong with me where I have really been sort of in the market for taking part in clinical trials. I think that's always a challenging thing. I've known a bunch of people who've been involved with that. It's always concerning because it's something where there's sort of the criteria. The good news is, typically, if you get into a clinical trial, there's a decent chance it's going to work, because who wants to get somebody into a clinical trial and have them just be a negative data point for the FDA filing? That's one thing. I would say in terms of clinical trials, my comment would be this, that the more you understand about what on earth you're getting into, the better off you are. And there's a tremendous tendency in dealing with medical stuff for people to just kind of, for your average person who's never really studied anything about medicine, biology, whatever, to just sort of say, oh, I'll just do what I'm told type thing. My observation is, if you know stuff about medicine, biology, whatever, you can get much better mileage. And when it comes to clinical trial kinds of things, it's like, actually understand what they're doing. And, did somebody think this through and so on? Or is it just like, well, we'll try this. And, we didn't really think through this or that piece of it. I think one of my personal hacks, I suppose, is I have learnt over the course of time a decent amount about medicine. And, I consider myself at this point better than a mediocre doctor at, diagnosing things and so on. And it is remarkable when people tell you about diagnoses they've been given, where it's just like, that couldn't possibly be right. It's just like, it's like, somebody says there's two things going wrong, but there was one event. And it was just like, I don't think so. There's most likely there's one thing going wrong. But they couldn't quite figure out what that one thing was. So they told you two things. Or, it's a sort of a common phenomenon that, the young doctors who've just been through medical school and seen all the weird diseases will overdiagnose the weird stuff. The old doctors who have been practicing for decades and have, almost never seen a case of whatever, unless they're at very fancy, whatever, sort of teaching research type hospitals, they'll just assume it's the common thing and not the weird thing because they just don't see the weird thing. So I think this question, and by the way, with diagnosis, it's interesting because diagnosis is something that is a skill that comes up in a lot of different fields. It's something in software diagnosis, for debugging. There are people who are really good at that. There are people who are bad at it. There are people who know a lot but can't do debugging. There are people who just have a good sense and are tenacious enough. They'll just, get there. And where they also don't, the number one problem of diagnosis tends to be at the beginning, you think, oh, it's 5 things it could be. And then you go through and maybe it is one of those things. Okay, great, then you're done. But maybe it isn't any of them. Or maybe you reject a bunch of them. If it's medical type stuff, it'll be there's a very low probability you have this particular thing wrong. We did the test, there's a low probability of that. If it's software debugging, same kind of thing. We did the test, we should have seen this on the log file, we didn't see that, etc. And so then what happens is you reject all the high probability things. And then you don't go back and look at the lower probability ones. That's just a terrible mistake people make because they think, oh, I already excluded that. I know it isn't that. I know that piece of the software system, that medical thing, that's okay. But in fact, by the time you've rejected all the high probability things, you should go back to the low probability one and try and understand whether it's that. That to me is sort of the number one thing. The other thing is people get, and it's related to that, they get sort of fixated on one explanation. And then even when some data comes in that makes it clear that that explanation is kind of wonky, it's like, why don't you look at this other one? Well, because we're locked in on this first one. And that's another thing that can happen. But, I would say that in, my own little hack for these things is when people tell me about, oh, they're complaining about this or that medical thing, I will kind of like ask a few questions and then actually offer, well, I think it might be this, this, and this. And then, then I ask people later, was I right? etc. And that feedback loop over the course of years and years has given me, that's, nothing compared to what an actual, doctor on the front lines really doing stuff is going to get. But it gives me some sense of, what is the intuition you need to be able to do medical diagnosis kinds of things? And I see Park is commenting that diagnosis is definitely a potential job for AI. I have worked on that at various times. I've been interested in, getting data. It's kind of complicated for medical privacy reasons to get the right kind of data. There are places you can get that kind of data. There are situations in which you can get the data and so on. I think that it is the case that it is in many ways a good job for AI that's not been as well executed as it might have been. I think the primary thing there is there's one thing that tends to happen is in medicine, it's very much human logical decision making. And so people say, well, we do this complicated test and we just want to know yes or no, or we want to know, is the value 7.4 or 9.2? We kind of crush down this test into something small. Genomics is one place where that isn't happening, where there's a lot of data. It's also a lot of kind of personal analytics, health monitoring kinds of things. There's, again, just a lot of data. Medicine, in the way it's usually set up, and diagnosis is usually has a pretty hard time with the patient who says, hey, let me give you a gigabyte of data. It's more like, well, let's do the 5 tests that let us make the diagnosis. Now that gigabyte of data to the right AI should be really useful. But of course, if the AI just does feature extraction and comes back down to, well, there are 5 features that matter, and then you might as well just be doing what you're doing right now. My feeling is that the future ultimately of medicine and medical activity is much more, right now we go from symptoms to diagnosis, like we've got a code, one of the, an ICD-9 code, one of whatever it is, 30,000 different codes that is the medical thing that is wrong with you. And then we go to the, what's the intervention, what's the thing we're going to do. I think increasingly in the future, what one will see is direct from symptoms to what one does. And the what one does will be much more parameterized, and the symptoms will not be symptoms. They'll just be the raw data of what was your, look at every single heartbeat. What happened over the last, million heartbeats, and how does that inform something that you do in the sort of some action that you take, is then a very customized action, not just oh, let's switch on this, let's give that drug, something like that. So let's see. Mikhail asks, can Wolfram Language screen for disease or illnesses? Not really. We have some information in Wolfram Alpha. We have some symptom type stuff, or we have some things where we've got some standard government databases that go from disease to its symptoms, and you can kind of go backwards and do some sort of Bayesian stuff to figure out, given these symptoms, what's the disease. But it isn't very sophisticated. And it certainly doesn't do this thing of taking sort of vast blobs of data and doing things with it. Now, people have done, both customers and people we've done sort of consulting projects for, have built non-trivial systems for doing that kind of diagnosis and for doing things like time series of diagnoses. If you have this and this and this, what's the probability that you'll have these different things? That's been done particularly for some insurance purposes and also for some and medical cost estimation purposes, things like that. And also because it's useful to individual patients. But yes, things like that have been done with our technology stack. There's much more that could be done. It hasn't been, I have to say, I am, one of the places where people sort of thought it's going to be a slam dunk, we're going to figure everything out, is genomics. And, I first got my whole genome sequenced in 2010, I think. And, comes back on a disk drive, basically, and there's your 6 billion base pairs. And then I got somebody to spend a few months kind of digging through that and figuring out what could be learnt from my particular genome, and nothing dramatic, actually. And then over time, like I had my genome sequenced a bunch of times now. There are these services where, when a new paper comes out, they'll send you sort of the report on how, on what your what that might mean that your what that might mean for you, because they can see, this paper reported this set of SNPs, single mutations in your DNA, and what your values of those SNPs are, and it tells you, based on that, what would be, what is your likelihood of getting this or that thing. And I have to say, to me, it's kind of like a modern version of the tarot cards, or crystal, whatever they are, crystal ball type stuff. It's fortune telling. It's kind of modern fortune telling, because I remember like a month or so ago getting something where it says I have a I don't know what, 3% chance or something to be left-handed. Well, I'm left-handed, and 10% of the population is left-handed. The one that also was there was I had like a very low percentage chance of being somebody who was interested in kind of organizing things and organizing information and so on. Yeah, well, I'm kind of on the high end percentile of organizing information, collecting information, and so on. In fact, just today, I got an email, which same source, which told me I had a 34% chance, which I suppose isn't so small actually, of getting trigger finger, which I managed to give myself through excessive mouse scroll wheel mousing a few months ago. It's better now, so I was sort of, I suppose that number isn't so small. 34% is not so small. So I maybe shouldn't be as dismissive of the fortune-telling character of that. Although I think in the population, it's like, it said 2 to 10%, I think, is the population rate of that over. I've never had that before. So once in my life type thing. So anyway, let's see. Oh, RBS is asking, is it possible to change human DNA intentionally by eating foods or taking medicine? You can affect the telomeres, the end caps of your DNA. People thought there are like 50 end caps, and after your cells are divided 50 times, you're done. And, you have to wait for the next generation type thing. But it's become clear that, exercise and general healthiness can make telomerase, add telomeres to the end of DNA. So there's definitely some effect on at least the end caps of the DNA. When it comes to the main part, it's no, you don't get to do that. You can, you can change methylation of the DNA. I don't think you can change its actual content. You need to go in and, you could let loose a retrovirus, or you could, or you can use gene editing, CRISPR-Cas9 and so on in principle, but that's a complicated medical style thing. That's not eat more spinach or something to have that happen. Let's see. Let's see. Mikhail is asking, do you try to convince your children to go to specific universities or schools, or do they decide by themselves without any impact from me? I have 4 kids, so I have an N of 4. And I would say in my N of 4, and there's one who's just in the process of doing those things right now, I don't think I have much influence. I mean, the only thing one can do is provide information. And I think that's sort of the right thing to do. And sometimes when there's kind of a this or that thing seems obviously to be the case, that if one knows it isn't, then provide the information that it isn't. I mean, I would say that with the whole college university thing, to me, the thing that is sort of there's a list of the from best to worst. US News and World Report kind of ranks the colleges, and many other places as well, from best to worst. That's just a very confusing and not useful thing, because all these colleges have different personalities, different strengths, different weaknesses, different characters at different times. I think there's a sort of probably a 10, 20 year sort of cycle of things getting better, worse. They're colleges that are just trying to really spruce themselves up, and they have a different character from ones where they're kind of coasting on their laurels, things like this. And there are ones where the way that kind of just the set of conventions, the culture of places will vary, and that varies at the level of the administration, at the level of the professors, and at the level of the students, and the kinds of things the students do and find interesting. I think one thing that is always a mystery, well, not really that much of a mystery, but it's a question, when you're an admissions department at a university, what do you think your mission is? Because, if you're an HR department, a recruiting group at a company, the mission is get people who will be productive working at the company. Pretty simple mission. That's what I assume the mission is. Maybe there are pathological recruiting departments where that isn't the mission, but in a first approximation, it's get people who will be productive in the setting of the company, get people who are going to fit in to the culture of the company. It's they're not going to be productive, but the number one thing is get people who will be productive at the company. So the question is, how does that translate? And maybe that productivity is something which is not just a matter of the person, it's also a matter of the company and the culture of the company, the needs of the company, the interactions people will have around the company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's sort of well defined. Now, for a university, it's a little less clear how that should work. And I think, there might be, the cynic might say, oh, bring people in where they'll contribute a lot to your endowment in some way or another. Bring people in where they'll be famous and that will make people think your university is cool. Or bring people in where the professors will say, thank you for bringing that student in, I really enjoyed teaching them, whatever else. Or where, you know, sometimes there are very direct things like sports related things where it's like, yeah, we can get that person, we're going to have a better, whatever it is, team. But most of the time there isn't that kind of sort of direct recruiting that's going on. And I think the default thing is, if you don't know what else to do and your admissions department, just get more students who are like the ones you already have. And so that tends to, it's not a bad strategy, but it tends to mean there are very definite cultures that develop at different colleges and they're self-perpetuating, so to speak. And not because everybody who comes in there decides they have to turn into a person who does X, but because that is the mechanism by which sort of the people are brought in, so to speak. And so I think it's important to understand, kind of as you go to different colleges, look at different colleges and things, it's like, what is that thing that's developed there, and do you like it, and do you fit in? Another thing I have to pass on, this is a very elementary thing, but you know, you're shopping for colleges, and it's like, what are you actually going to get? And one way to find that out is just go figure out what courses would you take in the first year or two if you went to that college. You could say, oh yeah, I think this college is great, and you know, it has a really good reputation, I like the look of its buildings, but then you realize, oh my gosh, I have to take all these courses and I'm not interested in any of them. And that's clearly going to be a lose. So you know, I think that's a worthwhile exercise. But anyway, a few thoughts there. That's about my level of control here. Okay, Surface commenting, multiple screens are nice, but I feel it's less productive sometimes. So the same thing as multitasking being a myth. Well, for me, you know, I have somewhat definite functionalities for my different screens. And so that helps me to kind of not have, if it was just a big mess, you know, one of my principles about sort of physical things in the world is like, don't have a big set of horizontal surfaces that you can put stuff on, because they'll just get piled up with junk. And so, for example, for my desk, one of the things I did, I don't know what it was, 30 years ago now, is I have these pullouts at the front of my desk. And so most of the time, they're pushed in, because that's what I have to do in order to sit at my desk. But if I need to do something like, I don't know, sign a document or something, you know, pull out the pullout, then I put the piece of paper on there, do what I'm going to do with it. Or sometimes, you know, for whatever special purpose, I'll pull out the pullout. I can use that as extra desk space. Now I'm looking at my desk from behind the camera here, and it has 3 pullouts, okay? And 2 of them are pushed in, and the third one has a certain amount of junk on it. But that pullout, I kind of know, I'm a little bit worried that if I put too much junk on it, the pullout is going to like collapse and destroy my desk. And so, you know, the cycle time of junk on that pullout is really quite short, you know, on the order of a week or 2, as opposed to the cycle time of junk on a random table that I might have, where the cycle time might be 10, 20 years. I mean, I remember I had friends in the academic world where I'm just thinking of one chap who I knew mostly in the 1980s, who had this office that he'd been in for a long time. It had these shelves and so on, and literally the whole office was piled absolutely high with papers. And you know, the papers probably down at the bottom there were from the 1940s. You know, this whole thing had kind of archaeologically built up. And that's, you know, that's what happens to flat surfaces if you don't have a sort of active effort to clean them, or you're not one of those people who just sort of congenitally has a clean desk, which is a fine thing. But then if you congenitally have a clean desk, you don't really need the desk in a sense. And so I tend to have these approaches where I don't like having these flat surfaces because things pile up on them, unless and I try to have this sort of temporary flat surfaces. That's my little hack for that. Let's see. So Abhinav is asking, say they feel like the person has a lot of interests, and they study lots of kinds of things. How does one manage? Oh, fascinating! My system has a life of its own here. Okay, how does one sort of manage learning lots of things? You know, what I tend to do is my life is sort of very project-based. It's kind of like I do one project, then I do another project. And so, you know, I like to kind of gradually absorb information about lots of kinds of things, although I tend to sort of say, what do I want to learn about this thing? You know, if I'm learning about, I don't know, animal communication, something I've been curious about for a long time, never really done a project on it, but I gradually kind of learn more and more and more stuff about it. And, you know, that's sort of gradually helping develop my intuition about what's going on. And eventually one day I'll do a project about it, and then I'll really kind of dig in and, you know, and systematically learn what I have to learn. But for me, at least, you know, I find I need kind of proto projects to kind of hang my learning on. Otherwise, I'm just sort of like, oh, I learned this random thing. I don't know how to fit it into my, you know, brain folders, so to speak. So there's that part. And then when in terms of deeply learning things, I really try to wait until I have a project in that area, and then I dig deep and really learn stuff. Because for me, I find it hard to remember sort of just random disembodied facts. I mean, I often feel like I'm reading through something and I'm, you know, it's some science news type thing or something like that. And I'll see some facts and I'll like, oh, that's an interesting fact. I've really got to remember that fact. And I don't think I remember them very well, because they don't get attached to things that are sort of the big structures that I'm really you know, able to think about. So that tends to be my approach. There's a question here. Any tips for fixing a chaotic file system? My files are scattered everywhere. Well, you know, the thing is, what do you want your files for? That's the first question. So for me, it's like my life is going to consist of doing projects, basically. So I want my files organized so that when I do a project in a particular area, I will have what I need. Now, the other thing is sometimes files are just like I need an archival bucket. And I want that bucket, and I think I've talked about this before. I mean, don't be too clever in how you name or think about your files. It's just like, keep it simple. That's a bucket from 1994. That's sort of all of my, you know, transactional records from 1994. Put them all together. Yeah, some of them might be related to, you know, the business you didn't start, or they might be related. Some of them are hobby versus, you know, business versus whatever else. But, you know, what's a hobby to you then might not be a hobby to you 10 years later. And so just put them all in a bucket where you understand where you would find things. Oh, that happened in 1994. Let's look all the way through that bucket. Because often, and when I say bucket, I mean file folders, online folders, whatever else, like conceptually bucket. You know, because what ends up happening is that you know, you want to have a quick way to throw something somewhere. You don't have to think too hard about it. Then, if the retrieval is slow, but you have to do it very rarely, then that's, you know, then that's a thing that, you know, the bigger the bucket doesn't really matter, because you're going to go through it anyway. For example, the thing so I've been writing something which relates to things I've done about a particular topic, second law of thermodynamics, over the last 50 years. And so I have good archives, but my archives are not perfectly organized. And I'm kind of hoping over the next maybe 5 years or more to have a project where I really get my archives properly organized. I mean, they're not bad. They're in these large buckets, but sometimes there's a miscellany box that was because that was just all the papers that were in a particular place at a time when they got boxed up, for example. And much of this stuff is OCR'd and searchable, but sometimes you don't even know what to search for. And so for me, I would, you know, we're going to try and build a sort of a real archiving system based on our technology stack that lets people kind of really organize things properly into dated order and so on, so you can kind of see the sequence, into different kinds of categories and so on. But I would say that the thing to think about is, can you make fairly big buckets, bankers boxes, whatever they actually are physically, of things, and maybe you have 10 of those laid out on the floor somewhere, and you're going through a bunch of files and you don't really know where things go, and you just put them into the banker's box to which they most fit. And then, one day when you need to use these things, it's like, well, okay, that's banker's box, number 8 or something is going to have that kind of stuff. Okay, let me go through that. And I have to say that for me, and I always find it very satisfying when I get to take something disorganized and organize it, and it's an activity that is kind of even when if I'm tired or generally whatever, not very not up to peak productivity, that's something that I can do, and it's kind of satisfying. I have to say, one thing that I've noticed, it was a question earlier about what does one do when I'm sort of stuck in the mud on things. What I tend to do is I save up all kinds of activities that I'll say, I'm going to do this when I'm tired, if I'm sick, if I'm, whatever else. And unfortunately, I've accumulated way too many of those things because I've thankfully been feeling pretty energetic last quite a while. And so the things which are, let me do that when I'm not feeling so energetic, have been piling up and not getting done. But the thing that I find is that there are certain kinds of things that seem to require me to be kind of at my most energetic feeling. So for example, writing. If I'm going to write something that is going to have a spark, a spunk to it, I kind of have to be really kind of like all there and energized. And whenever I'm writing something, when I'm like, I do a certain amount of work when I'm walking on a treadmill, or I do work when I'm in some random place that isn't my usual work environment or whatever, and I see what I've written, it's usually a little bit lame. And so I tend to now really avoid trying to do things like that when I'm in sort of compromised circumstances. Whereas something like processing email, writing code, those are things where it doesn't really matter where I am. I can kind of have equal performance on all those kinds of things. And by the way, I mean, sort of the processing, I get a huge amount of email, and the thing that I tend to do, so when I'm working on stuff, I can usually work for, I don't know, I haven't actually timed this, but I think it's about an hour and a half, 2 hours maybe, of just consistent grind, write, do what I'm doing. And then I kind of feel like my brain is all, filled up or something. And I have to kind of get up and pace around and do something. And I have to do that for 10 minutes, something like that. And I have a terrible habit of going to get something to eat at that point, which is a terrible habit. And the only thing I've been able to do is to downgrade what I eat to have lower and lower nutritional value, so to speak. Because honestly, I'm only doing it as a distraction and as a kind of an anchor for, okay, I did something else. Now I can go back to what I was doing. But another thing that I will do then is to process some email. That's kind of a way of just sort of, it's not mindless at all. It takes thought, but it's a different kind of thought. It's a very sort of more pointillistic kind of thought rather than this coherent thing you have to do if you're writing something. Let's see. Philomena's asking, how do you write into a, Wolfram notebook? That's the, that's my actual, where I'm writing things into. I tend to, so, when I'm writing kind of material that is sort of intended to publish things, I'm a one-pass writer, almost always. I'll start, I'll write, I'll finish, it's done. Sometimes I'll have to have multiple starts, but I don't tend to be a go back and revise. My main observation is once I'm really ramped up to write something, I will write something coherent. If I go back and do surgery, that's the time I mess everything up. In other words, I gain more from the coherence of a one-pass writing thing than I gain from the sort of rethinking it and going back and doing editing and so on. So that tends to be my approach. And I usually, it sometimes takes me a while to get started. In every section that I write, it'll sometimes take me a while to like, how do I get into this? What is the beginning? Once I'm oriented, then I can be off and running. One of the things that's difficult in a lot of writing I do is some of it is sort of almost opinion writing or essay writing, where it's kind of like I'm writing more or less at output speed, and it's just sort of things coming out of my brain. But another kind of thing is where I'm doing research type things. Maybe it's technical, scientific research, maybe it's maybe it's historical stuff, and where the actual process, the actual research takes a long time. And that's painful actually sometimes, because what happens is I'll be, writing, and then I'll hit this research, this tough nut, and I need the answer to that tough nut before I can write more. And whenever I write around the tough nut and just sort of guess how it's going to come out, I regret that. So I really have to solve that tough nut, but that means I'm kind of blocked. And my lovely flow of writing, where I was doing so well, just gets blocked for a day, whatever it is, as we try and break that tough nut, so to speak. Now, for me, practically, when I do writing, I have this whole set of tools that we built for Wolfram Notebooks, where I put these extra cells in that are kind of instructions to people who are helping me, like, this picture is obviously messed up, improve it and do this and that and the other. Find, I've got some date, find the correct date, check this, do those kinds of things. They happen to be cyan, so there's the background color, so they get called cyan comments. That and then when there's a response, it's in a different color, and so on. And that's sort of, for me, a pretty useful way. Now, people can do that with various kinds of change tracking. I like this sort of full cell kind of change. I find that a useful way to do it. It's also convenient because it allows you've got sort of all the stuff there, and you just delete the cell when you're good to go. And sometimes when I'm making pictures, for example, I'll make a version of the picture, and then there'll be some details that have to be fixed, standardize the colors in this way or another. And what will happen is I'll go through a version of the document where somebody will have added in it was my version there, and then there's the new version, and then I just have to look at those two versions, and then I'll delete my version if I like the new version. And that way, that's sort of a fast way to finish that. There's a question here. How much do you use the mouse while writing in a notebook? Boy, I do not know. I mean, I have the data. I record every keystroke. I record every mouse move. So I have the data, and I don't know the answer. I do know that I managed to give myself this trigger finger thing in my third finger of my left hand by using a scroll wheel on a mouse with that third finger, and just like ridiculously turbo scrolling, because I was doing some researchy type things where I've needed to just scan through a lot of documents and things. And I kind of gave myself a repetitive motion injury or something by doing that. Zayden is asking, do you have preferences in reading hard copy versus digitally? It's interesting because I have some things like for instance, I have some books. They're old books, and I was doing sort of a personal history project. I'm about to do a general history project, and I have a bunch of these old books, and there's a certain, books are nice because there's a certain, you've got the whole thing right there. You have a visceral sense of, what fraction of the book am I looking at now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But it's sort of interesting because some of the things I was doing, I was like choosing to look at an online version rather than at the physical book that was right there. And other things, I like looking at the physical book. I think the online version has the great advantage. I can, if I want to keep notes, I can just screen cap a piece of it and stick it in a notebook and make a comment on it, and that's how I keep my notes. Whereas in the physical version of the book, I've got a very large collection of bookmarks. We have lovely bookmarks that we made for, I don't know, there's some NKS related bookmarks. And I've got the big stack of bookmarks in this drawer behind my desk. And I'll, when I'm doing a project, there'll be books that I have, physical books that are just full of bookmarks. and then kind of at the end of the project, it's like pull all the bookmarks out and recycle them. But it's sort of a satisfying moment, actually. But you know, that's sort of a trade-off of do I do that by copy pasting a piece of text or screen capping something and sticking it somewhere, or do I do that by putting a bookmark in the book? And they have somewhat different utilities. In terms of and I did find myself literally in the last few days going literally backwards and forwards between an online version and a physical version of some documents. So it's right on the kind of the knife edge of which one is better there. I would say that sometimes when I'm trying to get sort of the overall picture, I kind of like often the physical book because it does have this visceral sense of sort of where are you in the book type thing. When it's this more kind of structured thing that I'm doing, I tend to be in the online mode more than the paper mode. And also for some of these books, okay, the occupational hazard problem is that I have a few books that I recently got from a certain source where they're moldy, and I'm allergic to mold. And so I put these books in plastic bags and things, and it's kind of a occupational hazard type thing, taking them out and getting allergies. I did discover I have a kind of a storage unit with a bunch of material, particularly actually from my parents and earlier generations of just material, some of which was not well kept in the past and has some mold. And I did recently go there to go and sort some more stuff, found some interesting things, actually, quite interesting things. Now that everybody has masks, everybody's got masks, I thought, gosh, now I can finally, let's just use a standard, mask. And by golly, I didn't get a mold allergy. So I finally found something that I actually want to use a mask for, so to speak. In any case, it's also nice that it's socially acceptable now in some situation where you think, oh my gosh, I'm going to get some nasty droplet-borne disease from somebody, that you can wear a mask and people don't think it's as horrifying as they might have thought in the past. Park is commenting, you should have an automatic email word cloud generator. That's interesting, actually. Actually, we haven't. I don't think we've really tried that. For a given email, yeah, I mean, most emails I get are not so long. By the time the email is long, kind of all bets are off anyway. I mean, it's going to be a challenging thing to get through. And I'm sort of, but it's an interesting idea to be thought about. Let's see. Philomena is asking, does UV hurt the paper? Most paper that I have is stored in boxes in an archive room, so it hasn't really seen the light of day. For sure, I mean, I've had trouble with books. Actually, I have a problem right now that, okay, silly problem of I have books, and I thought I'll put some, I have some books that are in a particular location that happens to be something, not the books here, but the books nearby here, that are in a location which can get direct sunlight, but they are also relevant. They get direct sunlight for the same reason as the fact that when I'm sitting there, I can see directly out of a window. And that is a place where I do Zoom meetings and things from time to time. And I kind of, I want to have some nice books there. And actually, what I realized is, oh my gosh, if I can see outside, that means outside can see in, and it can see the books that are behind me. And so then the question is, are these books going to get destroyed by UV light? And I think in a place where this is a house and a room that was built 20-something years ago, that I think when built it, put some UV coating on this window because we knew about this issue. And yet it is the case that some of the books that have been there for 20 years have started to fade a bit. And, the red ink goes first. And that's that's a place where, yes, things get damaged by UV light. And it's kind of a pity in a sense that one's putting things there that in another 10 years will have been significantly damaged. Let's see. Yeah, Paul is commenting, physical books are heavy and bulky. Ebooks are never bigger than your favorite tablet. You're absolutely right. I mean, there are too many times when I've gone on a trip somewhere and I really am doing something where I need physical books, and I go ship a box of books there, and it's all a big pain in the neck. And yes, that's a pain in the neck. It's much better if it's just an online thing. Some of the time I'm looking at historical stuff where the only form of it is in a physical book. I was also surprised when I was looking at archives. In fact, just right before this meeting, the thing I was doing was, because I'm writing this piece about some personal history and so on, I was looking at an archive box where I have scans of what's in the box, but it's kind of fun because what's in the box is Scotch taped together images that I used for some papers that I wrote and things like this. And the scanner doesn't see that. The scanner is just flat on, doesn't see it. So I'm like, well, and also some of the things are very big and actually weren't scanned properly because they're line printer outputs and they're very big. And so I thought, so I better go and actually, open the box, put it out on a table, take pictures of it. And that's a case where the actual physical thing is necessary. The scan is not good enough. There's another case I was looking a few months ago. I was looking at in the making of the NKS book. I wrote a piece about this, and I actually wanted to look under a microscope at some printouts that I had. And obviously the scans that we have are, high resolution for scans, but they're not microscope resolution. So that was another case where one actually had to get out the physical thing. It's a question, what is the oldest book I own? Certainly I have ones from the 1600s. Do I have earlier than that? Maybe one from the 1500s, I'm not sure. I'd have to look some of that up. I've tended to, I have got, when it's a famous book, I don't know, Newton's Principia, something like that, I don't really care about owning a fancy early edition of it because it's, well, I will tell you a story there. Many years ago now, it must be, 30 years ago almost, I considered buying a Newton's Principia. It was expensive, $100 and something thousand. I don't remember exactly how much. And, the way it usually works with these kinds of books, you get sent the book. And it's like, do you want to keep this? If you do, send us the money type thing. And, I have to say that my reaction to it, of this very expensive thing, was, I don't want to have this. Where am I going to put it? I'm going to keep it in a safe. I'm going to worry about it. It's been around for 300 years. I'm just its keeper for a few years here. Let me make sure it doesn't get destroyed. And I'm going to have to keep it in a very controlled environment. And if I want to see what's in Newton's Principia, I can go look for that anytime online and so on. And then the other thing that actually held me back was, realistically, if I bought something like that, I'd never sell it. So it's not really an investment. But if I kind of think of it as an investment, it was actually an interesting problem that, okay, this is a history of science little moment here, but antiquarian books, their value is very dependent on details. Like you go through every single page, and if there was a blemish on one page, dings the value by a big factor. And so then in this particular case, there was sort of a piece of scholarship where people just didn't know the answer. Back in the day when books were printed, people would just print off pages, and they'd print a stack of those kinds of pages, then they'd print a stack of those kinds of pages. And the question was, there were actually two versions of Newton's Principia, the export edition and the edition that was sold. And it even says in the book, it's available in the lane behind so-and-so's church in London. There was a bookseller who hawked copies of Newton's Principia, and that's where you got it. And then there was another version that got sent to different places. And there was sort of a question of which one was printed first. Was one of them systematically printed first and then the other one second? And if that was the case, it would have at least a factor of 2 effect on the price of those things in the market. And some scholarship have been done of people going around to different libraries. There are, I think, 500 Principias were printed, maybe it's 1,000. and maybe 200-300 are extant now. I'm forgetting the exact numbers, but anyway, somebody went around and looked at a bunch of Principias that were in libraries and looked at the misprints. So as the pages got printed, people would gradually sort of fix the misprints. And so a later printed page would have different misprints than an earlier printed page to figure out whether the export edition was before the sold by Mr. So-and-so in the whatever, in the lane behind whatever it was. And they couldn't discern a pattern. But the thing that I was one of the things I was concerned about is getting this as sort of investment thing. And then somebody does another piece of scholarship, even if they get it wrong, and they announce, oh, we just discovered that the export edition was printed first. Well, then if you didn't have an export edition one, oh, your thing loses value by a factor of 2. So I was not, but the most important thing was just it didn't seem to have a lot of psychological value to me to own this thing that I was going to have to keep in a safe. So what I have got is a lot of minor old sort of science and technology books. And those are super interesting because you can't readily find those. Sometimes they've never been scanned at all. Sometimes they're obscure to find. Like, for example, for Newton, one of the books I have of his was his book on the chronology of ancient kingdoms, which was a book he wrote right at the end of his life, where he was trying to, date when was the fall of Troy, when was this, when was that, to compare it with astronomical observations. It wasn't a terribly good book on his part, but it's interesting. It's interesting to see, and it's fun to kind of see his thought patterns there. But that's a book that, it's not, I'm sure it's, I have a first edition of it. I don't think it's worth terribly much because it's an obscure book. It's not the famous book. So, that's what for a long time, I collected the minor works of major figures and things like this. And just an awful lot of stuff that is kind of the stuff that you don't readily find in the obvious kind of, reprint edition type things. And that stuff has been very useful to me in historical research that I've done and so on, of all kinds of things that I found there that, even just physically having the books makes it useful. And, have I gone through every page of every one I have? No, I absolutely haven't. And, it's one of those things I one day would love to do. I'm very much in a build the future mode, even though I keep on getting dragged into writing about history. And that's just something some of these cases I'm doing the history things mostly because I think it's going to be really easy, and then it doesn't turn out to be, but I want to do a good job anyway. All right, I think I have to wrap up and go back to my day job here in a moment. But RBS is asking, do you think storage devices like tapes and punch cards might come back sometime? I wouldn't count on that. I think I've been having a heck of a time figuring out whether paper punch tape from the very first computer that I used, whether there's any place to read it. We found the tape reader at a computer history museum, but on the can one buy it off eBay? It seems like that technology from 40 years ago is already gone enough that you can't even buy it off eBay. We'll see. And punch cards, I don't know. I assume that you could. I don't know how you'd read a big card deck these days. I think with this paper tape, what I'm planning to do is basically just lay it out in strips, photograph it, and just do sort of optical recognition on it from that. But I think the for punch cards, I wonder if you can buy a retro punch card reader. I'm sure you can. And I think in terms of whether it's a useful form, as somebody who used paper tape and punch cards, I would say stick with online storage or portable, or thumb drives or something. I wouldn't, amusing as those things are at a retro level, they were a pain in the neck to actually use. I mean, by the time you would have a card deck and you would drop your card deck, and then good luck, you'd have to resort the cards, and it's just a huge mess. Or even, all those things where you'll be putting rubber bands around the around the thing to keep the card deck from falling apart, and you put the card deck in the pigeonhole to give to the computer operator, and the thing would self-destruct in some way, and it just like, I'm sorry, we couldn't run your card deck because we dropped it. You know, these are things that I think are best relegated to the well, the phrase I usually know is dustbins of history, but I think that has to be translated into American, the garbage cans of history, so to speak. I think those are not things that I would relish seeing come back as a practical matter, other than for retro amusement, so to speak. All right, we should wrap up here. I'm actually about to go off and do a day job live stream about Wolfram Language design. Well, thanks for lots of interesting questions. Always gets me to think about things I don't otherwise think about, so I appreciate that, and hope you find it interesting. And until the next time, bye for now.